grieving. Some families will be lost to one another forever. To those of you who face the difficulties of reconnecting with family and establishing ongoing relationships, we say sorry. We offer this apology in the hope that it will assist your healing and in order to shine a light on a dark period of our nation's history. To those who have fought for the truth to be heard, we hear you now.
You're listening to Adopt Perspective, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption. I'm one of your hosts, Jo Sparrow. This podcast is a production of Jigsaw Queensland Post-Adoption Support Service. However, the views expressed are those of the people participating, not necessarily Jigsaw Queensland. The podcast discusses adult themes and listener discretion is advised. Today we have a bonus episode to address a topic that we'd planned to look at later in the season, but as it has recently made headlines, we've brought it forward. Tragic cases of children dying while in care or in families known to the department draw widespread attention, as they should. These tragic events are often accompanied by renewed calls that adoption should be more routinely and genuinely considered as a solution for some children in care. At the same time, we as a community have owned up to and apologised for past forced adoption practices and have declared that they will never happen again. There has also been much acknowledgement of the detrimental impacts of legally severing a child's relationship with their biological family and changing their birth certificate. Dr. Trevor Jordan is President of Jigsaw Queensland and a long-term advocate of responsible adoption reform and education. For 20 years, he taught public and professional ethics at the Queensland University of Technology. As an adopted person in the closed adoption era, he developed a particular interest in ethics and adoption. I recently spoke to him about permanency versus adoption and learning from the past. Hi, Trevor. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Jo.
What are the alternatives to adoption that will meet the needs of children who are in and out of home care, sometimes for most of their childhood?
Well, this is the real issue because, as a community, we've looked at the past experience with adoption and made communities apologise for past forced adoption practices and promised that they would never happen again. And yet there still remains the issue that some children, for various reasons, are not safe in their families and may need to be looked after outside that family. So people quickly look at the lists of a number of people waiting for adoption, and then they look at the long list of number of children in out of home care and think, well, here's a simple solution. But it doesn't work that way. At the moment in Australia, at any one time, there's about over 50,000 kids in out of home care. Now, some of those will return reasonably quickly to their families as matters are resolved. So you're probably looking at about 45,000 Australia-wide in out-of-home care, but 50% of those are in their extended families. In other words, they're being looked after by relatives, not their parents, but by uncles and aunts and grandparents and in their family. So the picture is often, people often quote the larger number of figures without realising that part of the system is working reasonably well in the sense that these kids are being looked after by people who they know in their extended families. But there's another thousands of kids who will spend 2 years or longer out of their family and in if you like the system in foster care or with other people who are taking parental responsibility for them, and some of those, percentage of those won't be returning to their families, and will have someone else will parent and have the parental role for them until they turn 18. Now, people who've been affected by adoption in the past are always concerned when people immediately see as adoption a solution, because often the people making those calls don't acknowledge that things have to be different. And at the same time, our experience is in Queensland, where the government has got together with stakeholders who are affected by past adoption to talk about this issue, that most of the stakeholders in adoption reform and people who've welcomed the apologies for past forced adoption accept that the children do need relational permanency. They need some kind of legal permanency in the sense of who has the parental role for them, at least they turn 18. And they need just the stability and geographical stability of not being moved around in the system. So in many ways, people realise that, but we're still concerned if it's going to look like adoption in the past, then it's not going to be a solution. What's different about, I guess, why adoption doesn't work, and to fulfil our promise that it won't happen again in our community, as forced adoption was, is that adoption, what's called plenary adoption, which is the usual kind of form of adoption policy and practice around the world, legally terminates all rights and relationships with the family of origin. So you become totally a member of a new family, and they're put down on your birth certificate as the parents, and all rights are terminated with your family of origin.
And that's more than just parents, isn't it? That's grandparents, siblings.
Exactly, yes. So it's not only that you're severing the parental role, you're severing relationships with grandparents, or sometimes with brothers and sisters. You may end up with a different name. So most people now, sometimes it may be necessary to terminate a person's parental role with their children in very rare circumstances, but that's not a reason to sever their relationships with the rest of their family, their siblings and their grandparents, and it's certainly not necessarily a reason to completely change their identity. So in Australia, all the state governments advocate permanency as an alternative to children. I suppose the usual language is languishing in the foster care system and going from one set of foster parents to another, sometimes having anything up to double figures number of placements in their lives. So most of the governments are on board about permanency. In New South Wales is a state that still stresses adoption as a solution, a permanency solution. But even in New South Wales, they realise that this issue of severing relationships and identities is not necessarily a good idea. So that's why in New South Wales they advocate what's now called open adoption, so that when an adoption order is made, that the relationship with the family of origin is as far as possible maintained. But generally, most of the other states see that permanent guardianship to age 18 is a better alternative than adoption. And even the advocates of adoption in Australia are leading towards what's called simple adoption rather than this traditional plenary adoption. And simple adoption would mean that you may become part of a new family, but you don't stop being part of your family of origin. So you're legal, even though you might be adopted as a family, you're added on to another family who accepts family responsibilities. It doesn't remove or take away your original family doesn't cease to exist. So that's why some people who are still advocating for adoption are realising that they should be advocating for not only open but simple adoption, because a lot of the children in care, except perhaps for the infants, many of them are older, and so they know where they come from. They know who they're related to. They've got a name. It doesn't necessarily need changing. And in most jurisdictions, changing a name is not recommended. So, these sort of solutions are much preferred than the traditional view of adoption. But sadly, when they see a tragedy occurring and they recommend adoption as a solution, as the coroner recently did in Queensland, the general community is not always paying attention that this has to be different to what people think about as adoption in the past, and that there are alternative forms of permanency and care that are probably more suitable and address issues that the forced adoption inquiry addressed, which is the identity issues and identity confusion that arises for simply changing the name of a child and severing their relationship with their family. There's issues of informed consent being required from parents before kids are put into care on a permanent basis. These are issues that remain to be addressed and paid attention to when we seek to make alternative arrangements.
So, Trevor, adoptions in Australia are numerically low and waiting lists are perceived as long. Can you see how people would be tempted to see adoption as that simple solution?
Oh, sure. I mean, and generally people latch on to the things as simple as possible. But in the world of families and family relationships, things are rarely that simple. Even those that advocate adoption as a solution, and in, say, in New South Wales, where they're trying to increase the number of adoption orders, those numbers might climb up to triple figures, such 120 or 140, rather than the low figures in other states. It's only a drop in the ocean to, the number of children. So, they're not 40,000 families lining up, not 20,000 if we take out the relatives who are putting their hands up to look after kids. There's not 20,000 people on those lists. And the challenges are the normative challenges of raising a child who's had adverse child experiences, which many kids in the system have. You have to be pretty well educated and informed about the challenges you're taking on, particularly as children are getting older, and the fact that removing a child from a family itself counts as an adverse childhood experience. So some of the children have experienced secondary, direct or secondary violence in their family, or neglect, or they've witnessed scenes in their families that are traumatic, and so they've already there. Plus, the instability of the arrangements has meant they've had disruption in their education as well as their family life and security. So fostering and permanent guardianship under these circumstances has to be done by people who are fully aware of the challenges that go with the territory. And so some simple solutions, like simply advertising for people to become foster parents or to become permanent guardians, can backfire and not be a solution unless people are fully educated and resourced. So not only do the people taking on the challenge need to be resourced, but we've learnt that unless you provide resources to the families of origin where the relationships have broken down, then more children will enter the system because their needs and issues have not been sufficiently met. And so children may still enter the system if those families who lose their children to out-of-home care are not resourced and given assistance and helped. So yeah, we tend to look for simple solutions too much. In the area, it's difficult because with these headline tragedies, there's two conflicting kind of tragedies that occur. One, a child is removed, and then a tragedy occurs. Or a child remains with their family of origin and a tragedy occurs, and whichever happens, then usually the government and the government workers are blamed for the result. So it's a difficult area in which to get policy and practice right, because but to do nothing is not an option. I think we all accept that, but we do have to put a lot more effort and thought into what's in the best interest of the child. What have we learnt from the past about how not to do it and not to repeat those mistakes? Just in every area of life, we often forget history and start doing things that we know haven't worked. They appear to be a new idea for a new generation. But so we have to keep on working and looking at practice. But certainly, I think we're at the moment now. For example, in the past, people who were waiting to adopt and people who were willing to foster were on separate lists available, putting their hands up to help. So what's happened is that it's become more logical and easier for people who are fostering children and perhaps are looking after children quite successfully, and what that child and the child agrees to be part of that family till they turn 18. The road has been smoothed for those children to move and families to move into a permanency arrangement. At the same time, I know here in Queensland, for those people who are willing to parent, who put their hands up to be on the adoption list, the option is now given for them to consider providing a permanent home to a child who's already in out of home care, rather than waiting forever under the old view of what adoption is. So those sort of changes are good, but there's broader systemic issues here of why so many kids are in out of home care that are probably to do with structural issues, economic issues, social issues, cultural issues. And these are more complex and need to be addressed. But
sometimes
at the end of each day, some kid needs a safe place to lay his or her head. And
sometimes it feels like we're putting a Band-Aid on a bleeding artery.
Well, that's right. Yeah, and there's many good things have been happening over the years to address these issues. And we need to realise that and to support it. But yeah.
So what are some of the problems that you see facing the changes that need to be made in this area?
Well, one, we do have to change our mindsets and get a little bit more honest here. Whether people are advocating for alternatives to adoption like permanency and guardianship, or whether they're wanting to advocate adoption and open adoption, we do have to be honest with ourselves here that about the challenges that are involved in looking after kids. We have to be honest about the numbers, and that a lot of these kids are being looked after in their extended families, and that's not a problem in most cases. We have to be honest that the most adoptable or kids who would be suitable for a permanent guardianship are often the ones with the least problems, easier to get on with. So the kids who are the most difficult are the ones who are going to be left out of the equation, and we don't want a child welfare system where it's the best because they reject. You don't make a system the best by not dealing with the kids who need the most. I think opponents, people who are opposed to adoption, need to be honest and to get the message of what's happening and why kids can't be in their families of origin. That not all families do look. Not all parents do the parental role very well, and sometimes that can be a safety issue for the children, and they have to get on board about alternatives to adoption. But we have to be honest that we have to address the issue of informed consent, that we can't just make these decisions on behalf of people and go back to the system that we had in the past, where professionals were making decisions that had lasting effects on children's lives. I think we have to look at terminology. I mean, I've been lucky enough over my years to be in conversation, obviously, with people who are adopted, but people who've been wards of the state, people who've had guardians, people who've grown up in foster families, some of them wanting to just stay with that arrangement, and some of them wanting to actually be, as adults, adopted into the families. I've had these conversations, and there's not one size fits all here. It's about relationships and trust, and And really, who one identifies with and builds trust with depends on the way in which we treat each other, and that in the long term, that's very important. There are many kind of needs here, and I know people who were in orphanages or were wards of the state who, in the past, they actually wanted to be adopted. And of course, we've met people who were adopted who it's a tragedy and they were abused and not looked after well. And, we need to be more responsive to individual needs in this area. And whatever policies that happen, it can't be set and forget. It has to be adequately resourced before a decision's made. More adequate resources, community for everyone in the community, for everyone involved in these decisions and their impacts. And it has to be more resources available to people after decisions are made, so that families who are struggling with the issues that go with raising a child who's had multiple adverse childhood experiences are able to get help and assistance in a timely fashion and whatever arrangements that are made, or when a family loses a child to the system, that they're continued to be looked after and their needs addressed rather than simply forgotten. Because one of the issues with permanency and adoption is that they're seen as alternatives to out-of-home care, and once people are in a permanent relationship of guardianship or adoption, they no longer appear in the figures of out-of-home care because they have a home of an alternative sort. So we have to be realistic that this is not simply a numbers solution here. That it's about relationships and having people resourced to work through and to learn and to grow in a family and to adopt the parental responsibilities and roles that go with that.
Well, look, thank you so much for your time today, Trevor. It's a complex issue, and it's one where we must look to the lessons of the past before we act and repeat mistakes into the future. So we'll be teasing out more of these issues in future episodes. But thank you, Trevor.
Thank you very much, Jo.
Thanks for listening to the Adopt Perspective podcast. If you'd like to find out more, go to the podcast page on www.jigsawqueensland.com and you'll find a wealth of information and resources on the website. If you reside in Queensland, you can reach Jigsaw Queensland's Forced Adoption Support Service on toll-free 1800 210313, or you can call Jigsaw on 07 33 58 6666. If you live in another state of Australia, you can still call the Forced Adoption Support Service number, and your call will be answered by the Forced Adoption Support Service in the state that you're calling from. In every other state, Relationships Australia operates this service. A big thank you to Matt Sparrow for composing and recording our original theme music. Until next time, I'm Jo Sparrow saying farewell from Adopt Perspective, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption.